What does it mean to live natural lives? Welcome to the Convocations program at Carleton College. I'm your host, Carrie Rott, Director of Events. And we will be together for 1 hour, and we'll include some time for questions, and we'll be using the Q&A. Just use that Q&A tab on your screen at any time. I'll pose questions to our speaker at the conclusion of his presentation, but we will also be doing some interactive activities, so be ready to post your comments there using the Q&A tab. Our speaker today is Scott Freeman, Carleton class of 1978, a distinguished environmental educator. He's currently a principal lecturer in the Department of Biology at the University of Washington, where he won a Distinguished Teaching Award and published research on how innovative approaches to teaching science can benefit all students, particularly students from disadvantaged backgrounds. He's authored textbooks which have sold over 500,000 copies and been translated into multiple languages. His first book for a general audience, Saving Tarboo Creek, One Family's Quest to Heal the Land, blends his family story with powerful universal lessons about how we can all live more constructive, fulfilling, and natural lives by engaging with the land rather than exploiting it. Passionate about his work, Freeman shows the connections of scientists beyond the research lab. The title of his presentation is Working for Salmon and Social Justice. Welcome back to Carleton, Scott Freeman.
Thank you, Carrie, and thank you all for being here. Great to be interacting with you. And as Carrie said, I'm going to be asking you a lot of questions or for feedback or observations as we go. So would really love to hear from you as we go along, and then we'll do some general Q&A at the end. But I want to start out by sort of setting up the general theme of the talk this morning and our time together. And I chose this title, Working for Salmon and Social Justice. And you think, okay, the two big things I do is work on habitat restoration projects and work on research and practice to try to bring equity to higher education classrooms. And so today I'm going to try to tell these two stories. And I told my wife I was going to attempt this, and she said, how are you going to link them together? And I said, well, two things occur to me. One is that it's the work I do. One is my day job and one is my evenings and weekends job. And the second is that I see these as the two biggest problems facing our communities, our societies, the world. One is what I call healing the planet. That's the salmon part for us. And the second is trying to create the first equitable societies that have ever occurred in human history, which is the work I hope a lot of you were engaged in and pointing your future to. And I'm going to harken back to a man named Aldo Leopold, who is my wife's grandfather, actually. And he was a conservation biologist and forester, active in the 1930s and 40s. And this is my favorite quote from his work. There are two things that interest me: the relation of people to each other and the relation of people to the land. And that sort of captures much more eloquently than I can this idea of we're working on social justice, relation of people to each other, and the relation of people to the land, which is doing something about the state of our planet. So let's launch in. I want to start with the equity piece. And the first question I want to show you guys some data to try to address is, how about higher ed? I mean, the world we're all living in. Traditionally, we think, oh, education is the door that people can use to improve their prospects in life and develop their skills and potential. And the first question I want to ask is, oh, really? Is that so? So look at this graph. I'm going to unpack it for you guys a little bit and then ask you to interpret it for me. So we've got time on the x-axis here. With these data they were published in 2015 by a research institute out of the University of Pennsylvania. The y-axis here, the vertical axis, is essentially the probability that if you're born into a family at a different income level, what's the probability you're going to complete a 4-year degree, get a bachelor's? And it's broken down. The 4 lines are by income quartile. This is all United States data. So the top quartile is in blue here that I'm tracing. The 50% to 75% family income quartile is in red, and then the third quartile and the bottom 25% of average annual income families are in purple on the bottom. So they absolutely slayed people. I was going to conferences where almost everybody was showing this slide, because to me, my takeaway is in terms of higher education, we're doing a great job of educating rich kids. But look at that bottom quartile. If you're born into poverty, it's basically saying, sorry, land of opportunity, maybe not so much. You have, not no chance, but virtually no chance of completing a 4-year degree. And it's been exacerbated. This issue has been exacerbated recently by cost, which I'm sure a lot of you are acutely aware of. So this graph, again, I'll talk you through this. We've got time on the x-axis again. And here, if you just looked at inflation, the consumer price index, which is a conglomerate measure of how costs are increasing, that's this black horizontal line. Then you look at, well, over time, new vehicles have gotten cheaper compared to other stuff. Food's gotten a little bit cheaper. Clothing has gotten a little bit cheaper. Ooh, we're not doing so well on medical care. People in this industry talk about, we've got to bend the cost curve because medical care has been skyrocketing. So again, if you could type in, what do you predict? I'm going to show you the data for higher education. Where are you expecting that line to be? Above or below the black, and what is it compared to apparel or medical care or some of the other items on this list?
Regarding the previous slide, Kristen says, disheartening to see the data so stark. And someone said, I'm struck by the widening gap between the top line and the rest of them. And it appears as if higher education is inherently linked to income level. Now, Gretchen has said, with regard to this one, up around 3. Nicholas, higher than medical care. Matt, above medicine. Sarah is above all others.
Bingo. Isn't that something? For those of you who are taking on debt, you're saying that's my life. So this is a huge issue. Like, why is higher education so expensive? And that's of course not doing anything to improve the ability of people who are born into families in the bottom half of family income to afford access. And it matters. And I'm just going to talk about economic terms, not in terms of sort of emotional, psychological, social status, just straight up income. How much money do you make? These are the best data I've been able to find. So again, this is median lifetime earnings by your top level of education. So this is the degree you finished. And if you look at a high school diploma, look at that number above it. This is average across, and again, these are US data. And look at a 4-year degree. So look at those numbers, and if you could type in over the course of a lifetime for an average person with a BA or with a high school diploma with no college, what's the average? What's the difference in terms of just dollar earning power? And you don't need a calculator. Just give me a rough number to get a sense of what's going on.
Nearly double with a bachelor's degree.
Almost double. It's about just shy of $1 million difference on average. And if you think, okay, well, I have a life partner who's also got a 4-year degree versus my friends from high school who finished their education then, and both of them, that partnership is in the same. Now we have $2 million difference over the course of a lifetime. So in terms of multi-generational opportunity and health, the college is enormous. It's huge in our economy. All right, one positive note on this issue: who's going to colleges? This is. I want you to guess at what these data represent. In 1900, there was 2% of something relative to this question of who's going to college. 2016, the most recent data I could find, 41%. Any guesses on what that 2% and 41% represent?
High school graduates that went on to college.
Yeah, really nice. Bingo. It's the percentage of 18 to 24-year-olds who are in college currently. So tell me something else. Who's your guess? Who was that 2% in 1900? if you had to characterize them broadly, what slice of society represented that 2%?
Christian says males.
Yeah, yeah, no question. And what income status would you guess?
Elite white men.
Yeah, it's the landed aristocracy, to be crude
Wealthy
about it.
white families.
Yep, yep. Okay, so the positive news is, look at this timeline. Abraham Lincoln signed the first land grant colleges, first public universities whose goal was to make higher education accessible to everyone, supported by the state. The whole idea of community colleges as an entree to higher education was invented in the United States. The first ones were established in 1900. The GI Bill after the Second World War opened up, made it financially feasible for hundreds of thousands of, again, mostly men. I was alive. I remember these newspaper stories and television stories of to me, some of the great heroes in my life, James Meredith, Vivian Malone, and James Hood and their colleagues who integrated the public university to the South in the early 60s. And now you guys are part of the first generation in the history of the human race, human species, where the better educated gender will be female. And nobody knows what that's going to look like. It's always been male dominated, and you guys are going to turn the tables on this. So to me, this timeline on the right side of your screen says, oh, we've democratized access, kind of, without, except for the cost deal. But we're not democratizing success. Remember those flat lines? That was, did you complete? All right, so how can we do better? And that's the problem I've been working on most of my career. So we have a long-term goal here that I articulate in changing values relative to higher ed and changing the system. I'm not going to live long enough to see that, but I hope some of you will be engaged in this debate. And to crystallize what's going on, this is the way I'd put it. If you ask someone, what are the really good schools, colleges, universities? What are the best, most prestigious? Is what we usually means. How would you fill in that blank? The most prestigious colleges and universities are the one that blank the most prospective students.
Gretchen says attract.
Ah, yes. That's true. They get huge application pools. What's their admittance? What's their acceptance rate?
Kristen actually suggests perhaps reject.
Yeah.
Or deny.
Yeah, so that's the other side of the coin. They got a huge application pool, but I think Harvard, Stanford, they accept less than 5% of their applicants. So basically,
Bradley suggests retain.
Oh gosh, I wish. Wow, that is the long-term goal. Yeah, fantastic. The prestige in higher education, and I would claim, is based on exclusion. And that's the long-term change in values in the system that I think needs to happen. Like, what do we think of as a good school? Is it one that takes students who were born into poverty or low income, but are motivated and have potential and love to learn, and really get them up to a level where they're gonna have fantastic careers? Are they ones who take privileged kids and supply more privilege? So that to me is the long-term change. The short-term change is that we can teach better. And that's what I work on in my day job. Is I put it here at eliminating disparities in achievement by changing the way we teach. So just to highlight what this looks like, so traditionally we've called these achievement gaps. There's a big debate on what better terminology. So if I'm going to use that off and on, but and I want to show you some data from 6 chemistry courses on my campus. This is work I did with a bunch of friends, was published about a year ago. So these 6 chemistry courses are general chemistry and organic chemistry. If you want to be a doctor, pharmacist, engineer, life science researcher, entrepreneur, and biotechnology, you got to take these courses. They are the gateway to most STEM, so science, technology, engineering, mathematics majors on every campus in the world. So really critical courses for people interested in science-based careers. So we studied over almost 26,000 students who'd taken these 6 courses on my campus, and we were quantifying what was going on between overrepresented students, meaning in the general population relative to who's actually doing science careers. Caucasians and Asians are overrepresented. Minoritized groups are these ethnicities down here. So I'm going to refer to this MGS. So African Americans, Hispanics, Native Americans, Native Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders are underrepresented in science and technology careers relative to their presence in the population. So National Science refers to them as underrepresented. We refer to them as minoritized groups. And then we were also looking at income, family income, just as a binary, low income, so low, sort of officially low socioeconomic status versus higher, as the students were concerned about tracking success. Okay, so these are data from the first course, which most students intending science majors take first fall freshmen. You just walked in the door at a college or university. And this is the average in that gigantic data set, the average grade difference for minoritized groups versus non-minoritized groups. And this is called a notch plot. You've probably never seen one. This is the median. So basically the average, these are 95% of the data between these lines. So you tell me, this is on a, these are the grade difference. So your read of those data, like how on average, minoritized groups are getting worse grades in chemistry. How much worse? If you can just read the graph and throw out a number that seems to capture it.
Sophie says half a letter grade worse,
Yeah.
about a
Yeah.
half a grade point. Half
Nice,
to
Sophie.
one
It's
letter
hard,
grade. Yep.
hard to read on screen, but yeah, that's only, it's about 0.54, but it's a lot. It's a lot. And we call those the raw differences, meaning that's what's on your transcript. That's what the student sees and makes a decision about, should I go on? Should I get out of here and do something else or leave college altogether? I'm not cutting it, or not cutting it, not doing well. This isn't my place. We also do the same analysis. This is a little trickier. So we also do the same analysis, and we control for SAT scores and high school GPA. And here, that's the gap. That's the difference right here. And this is controlling. This means that if you take a white or Asian student and take, let's say, an African American or Latino student with exactly the same high school GPA, exactly the same SAT scores, meaning they're, in terms of academic preparation and ability, they're equal. But what's the gap now? What's your estimate of that number?
Someone says about 0.15 points.
You guys are good. Almost exactly. Yep. Yep. So I laugh. It's not funny. This means that students are underperforming just based on their ethnicity and race. And BIPOC students in the group are saying, wow, tell me something I don't know. But this is huge to me. There's something actively, I'm going to use the word punishing, students from minoritized groups in these classrooms. And that's just something we have to do something about. And again, you know, these differences, these disparities that we're seeing every day in college classrooms have consequences. This is called this graph is showing, okay, how many students stay in chemistry if you start out with 100%. After the first course, second course, third course is organic chemistry, 1, 2, 3. We're on a quarter system at Washington. There are the gaps. So for whites and Caucasians, it's bad. Like only 65% of students are still in science majors by the time they're in, you know, through their second year. 40% have dropped out. But for minoritized groups, it's absolutely brutal. Like these careers are just shut off. For the people we need most in medicine and in my opinion, in my medicine and entrepreneurship and science. And then these gaps also, when you control for, again, indices of ability and preparation, it's still happening. Like it's not just about how good they are, which, you know, a lot of faculty said, oh, I can't worry about data like this. They weren't cut out for science. They weren't good enough. and you know, there were no racial overtones there. They were just saying that you have to be good to do this. That's not true. It's not just about preparation, and preparation about family income. So how do you like that? That's the key predictor. Okay, we can solve the problem, and that's the data I want to show you now. So first, I worked on it very briefly. I worked on a paper that was published 7 years ago. We looked at innovative teaching methods, which people lump under the term active learning. So anything where you're not just lecturing. And traditional lecturing, you know, you guys have all experienced it. You may still be experiencing it in some of your classes. Basically, the professor is telling you stuff and magically you're supposed to learn it. In active learning, the switch is actually, a friend of mine summarizes it in 3 words: ask, don't tell. And cognitive psychologists would say that's how human beings learn. We have to figure things out. We have to struggle. We have to be uncomfortable. We have to fail. And then we figure it out, especially working with other people. So it's very social, intensely, lots of group work, intensely social. So this paper showed that we had hundreds of studies all over the world, starting in 1942 to 1910. And we showed that on average, all students do better with active learning, all across all the STEM, against science, technology, engineering, mathematics disciplines. Then we said, after that was published, and that paper's had a huge impact. It's been downloaded, I think, almost 600,000 times. And then I wanted to know, okay, everybody's benefiting. Awesome. But how about the kids I grew up with and went to school with, minoritized groups or low income kids, and students. And I said, what's happening to them? So we found it was really hard to find the data. A lot of people either don't want to know or don't study it, or haven't occurred to them that maybe we can do something about this issue of equity in performance. So we did find students on data on exam scores where Asian American and Caucasian students were broken out how they were doing in contrast to the minoritized groups. And then with passing rates, we were able to find more data. So we had two kinds of data points, and this is what the data look like. So again, let me unpack this a little bit. So here, passive means students are passive. You're sitting in lecture. And an active is where you're engaged, you're working in groups, your professor is asking you questions all the time and getting you to suggest hypotheses and interpret graphs the way I'm doing with you guys. And then this is the exam score data. This is the passing rate data. And here are the gaps. This is minoritized groups versus overrepresented groups in exam scores and in passing rates. Okay, when we looked at the same courses, usually with the same professor, when he or she changed to at least some active learning, here are the changes we got. Gaps don't go away, but they get a lot better. And I mean, 33%, 44%, that's a lot better. So this was exciting. But the other thing is that we found out that if we broke it down finer and said, okay, well, what if you're only doing a little bit of active learning? Like, oh, you ask a couple questions. If you have, I don't know if you guys have used clickers or personal response devices or polling devices. Let's say you ask a couple of quick clicker questions. So, oh yeah, I do an active learning course, but it's really only 10 minutes out of the 50 or 60-minute class period. That would be low intensity. If you do high intensity, like the way I teach is no lecturing whatsoever. I talk about 33% of the time on average in my classes, but I'm always asking students to ask a question or discuss the previous question with the student. So that's called high intensity, where the students are working most of the time. This is what the data look like. And it's much more dramatic is the point. So if you do a lot of active, if you really break down your teaching and really flip your classroom upside down where the students are doing the work instead of the professor doing the work, actually in class, differences in failure rates almost go away. Not quite yet. And remember, we're fairly new at this as professors. Active learning has been kind of a thing for 10 or 15 years. So we're going to get better over time. And I hope you live long enough to see that these gaps will disappear as we get better. We just become better teachers. I find a lot of hope in these data. Okay, and the reason this is important to me, I'm just going to say I'm a true believer in democracy and in this country. I believe in the promise of America, not the reality. There's a statement in the Declaration. They said all men are created equal. And as you're probably very well aware, they meant white men who own land. That was but also in historical context, that was a radical statement. Like very few people on the planet accepted that statement. And this was the claim the country was founded on. Ever since then, we've been working toward this goal of all people are created equal. And, you know, we're in the struggle right now and will be for a long time. But I just want to emphasize, and my little bit is to work on what's going on in college classrooms. But I want to emphasize the importance of this aspiration. There has never, to my knowledge, been a society in the history of human races where there's been equal opportunity and equal access based on ethnicity, your religious beliefs, your gender. We're trying to do something that's never been done before. And I can't imagine a higher calling for you guys than to make this part of your life's work. Okay, now we're gonna switch gears to the second story. We've talked about the relation of people to each other and the relation of people to the land. You guys are living in the dawn of the sixth mass extinction in the history of life, and probably the era of most rapid climate change in the history of the planet. That might be a slight exaggeration. These are data on the change in temperature that occurred over the past decade. As you can see, the planet is almost literally on fire. So this story, or my part in this story, starts in 1935, actually, with this family right here. This gentleman with his back turned toward you is named Aldo Leopold. He was the guy quoted early in the session today. He's actually my wife's grandfather, and my wife and I actually met. We were both doing work at this place. It's a chicken coop. In 1935, it was full of manure. That's this pile of black stuff. They just, the Leopold family had just bought this place, and Aldo had this vision of trying an experiment to try to bring land back, to restore what he called health to land. And this was the first time it had ever been what now we call ecological restoration, first time it had ever been attempted. And this is where it happened. So again, this was 1935. My father-in-law, Carl Leopold, was in high school and he was taking a photography course. So he photographed, we have photo documentation of a lot of the early work the family did in the mid 30s and early 40s. He climbed a tree and took a panorama stitched together here. So the shack you saw a second ago is over here where I'm waving the cursor. This place was just devastated. It had been, the previous landowner had destroyed all the native vegetation and tried to grow wheat. If you know anything about the history of the Dust Bowl, people were trying to grow wheat on soils that never should. And when the drought years started, it was a complete disaster. Ecologically, one of the great disasters that's occurred in North America. So that's what the Leopold family bought. That's their starting point. And again, starting the first ecological restoration looked like this. This is my wife's Aunt Estella, who's now 94 and still living in Seattle. We see her regularly. This is Aldo, her dad, and they're planting pine trees. And again, this is the shack in the background here, and Aldo planting some trees near the entrance. So they did this work. Aldo actually only lived to work at the shack for about 12 years, but he was writing about what they were doing. And I like to say, more importantly, he was trying to explain to himself and the world why they were doing it, which is really the important question for us all. And see here, he's working on his journal in front of the shack. He published a book that talked about the what and the why, called a Sand County Almanac, that's now considered a classic, one of the best-selling books ever in conservation and environmental writing. It's been translated into 13 languages and sold over 13 million or 2 million copies. And this is a book I read at Carleton College and changed my life in a profound way. And just as an aside, these are what the pine trees look like now in front of the shack. And Susan's dad, my father-in-law, planted these trees, some of these trees. And when he was in his late 60s, the family was doing a thinning operation, and he got the logs and sawed them up and built a house. So just want to say to you guys, That would be cool. If you can plant some trees in the next few years, think about coming back and building yourself and your family a house when the trees are big. What a thing to do with your life. Okay, so our little part, Susan and I met at the shack, and when I started graduate school, we moved out to the West Coast from the Midwest and ended up in Seattle. So we're in the Pacific Northwest here, where my cursor's waving. This is Puget Sound in Seattle, for those of you who know the Pacific Northwest. And the project we've been working at, we'd always dreamed about doing a restoration project. And finally, you know, we were saving money, and finally we were able to buy a little piece of land in what's called the Tarboo Creek watershed, which is what this map shows right here. So this is, Tarboo Creek is a little salmon stream. It's only about 7 miles long, it's teeny. And it runs into the Pacific Ocean, into what's called Daybob Bay. And this is part of Puget Sound, which is part of the Pacific. So that's where we are, and this is how we started. So I'm going to ask you guys for some feedback here in a second. If you look at this photograph, this is what the creek looked like when we got involved in 2004. So trace my cursor here. This is the creek, and this is a little tributary stream. And what do you notice about the creek where I'm tracing it and these tributaries? Carrie, is anybody noticing anything?
Yeah, Matt says no riparian.
Yeah, it's all, the forest was stripped probably here in the late 1890s, 1880s.
Got someone who said the creeks have been straightened. Yes,
exactly, straight lines. Yep. And the place we bought actually was the worst. It was the most heavily degraded habitat in the whole watershed. This is just the area I'm showing you in this photo is just downstream from where we've been working. Our family's been working. This is a friend of ours, actually from Minnesota, who's in one of the ditches and she can't see out. It was over the, as I say in the book, it was 6 feet under. So this is what the creek looked like when we started. It had been abused for over 100 years, starting with the removal of the forest, as you guys noted. But one of the reasons we were attracted to this project is not only we wanted to do a lot of the work ourselves, but there was a community forming to try to do something about, as it turns out, the entire watershed. And the guy standing here, Peter Bales, has been the individual really spearheading this effort. And he had a little grant to bring an excavator in. This is Bob Harrison. He makes his living digging basements, and 2 or 3 months of the year in the summer, late summer here when creeks are low, he is the go-to guy in Western Washington for remeandering creeks, for restoring creeks. So here, this is the ditch you're seeing right here that was 6 feet under. You can see the line of the ditch here, and he's scraping it back to try to get the stream bank into a more natural shape. And then once that channel is redug with the excavator, Bob would, we would scavenge logs from logging sites where they had, you know, logs that were hollow or too scabby to go to the mill. So we'd bring those over, and Bob would rumble over in the truck and toss one down in the new channel and say, he chain smoked, Camel Straits. I mean, he was serious. And he'd take that cigarette out of his mouth and say, "Hoo-wee, the fish will love that," like that, because he's a fisherman. So then you add wood, and then we would come in. This is my son, Peter, my son, Ben, Susan, her dad, Carl Leopold, he was 85 at the time. We're all helping. And this is going to be, unless you've done this work, this is going to be a tough question, but I'll throw it out there anyway. And just in case any of you have worked on stream restoration, what are we doing? So this is the edge of the new creek bed that Bob dug with the excavator. Any idea what this stuff is? Looks like netting, or what Peter and I are doing here?
Sarah suggests preventing erosion.
Perfect. Yes, thank you. This is coir. It is a jute netting, and it helps hold the soil in place. And then we're pounding willow stakes into the ground that we harvested, and we cut up big long willow stems. And two things happen. They hold the coir in place. So when it starts flooding in the winter, after we get big rains here in the Pacific Northwest, that's our rainy season, is wintertime. And then the bonus is that the willow stakes sprout and they'll grow into, 30-foot tall willows eventually. So it's a basic technique in stream restoration around here. Okay, so next step, there you can see the willow stakes in place, the new channel that Bob dug, the wood has been put in place. All right, here's another tough question, unless you grew up around here. What is he doing? He's throwing gravel into the bottom of the stream bed. Why would he do that? Again, if you're from the Midwest and East Coast, just don't worry about it. But if anybody grew up around here might have an idea.
Matt suggests salmon spawning.
Exactly. Yep. Salmon spawn in gravel. So if it's not there, you have to add it. So that's what this step is about. And here's the completed bed. And it's called a remeander because you can see instead of a straight line, the creek is crooked again. So that's the meandering channel. And then the water came back in when we dammed up the old ditch and diverted the water into the new channel. That was a great moment. That was just almost brought tears to our eyes to see this creek come back to life after being, literally in a straitjacket for over 60 years. So the remeandering was done. This is Gene Jones, who's a spiritual leader and elder of the Port Gamble Sklallam Nation, one of our indigenous groups in Puget Sound. Gene is hosting a dedication ceremony and singing a welcome song to the folks who were involved in getting this whole project together. And a couple of weeks after Gene led that session, about 150 school kids from local schools showed up to plant trees. And so this is January of 2005, and they're planting Douglas fir, western red cedar, all of our native trees all over. You can just see along the newly remeandered creek bank and then the adjoining riparian areas that, as you guys noticed, have been deforested for over 100 years. And the trees grew. This is Aldo Leopold, who planted trees as a teenager and was watching his grandkids plant trees 60 years later, 70 years later. It was thrilling for him to see now the fourth generation, my kids, the fourth generation of Leopolds engaged in this work. So this is what Tarboo Creek looks like today. This is our place. The excavator pictures I was showing you from right in here. And you can see no more, this is our place right here. And then, but this project has now involved dozens of tribes and government agencies, local, state, national, thousands of school kids planting trees, tons of other volunteers and Earth Corps and Conservation Corps folks in their 20s who came out and planted and removed invasives. So it's been an enormously successful project. Almost all of the watershed is protected now, either by conservation easement or by ownership by conservation organizations. And as Carrie mentioned, my wife illustrated and I wrote a book about this project. And again, I was trying to explain a little bit like Aldo why we were doing this kind of work. So that was sort of where our story was as of about 3 or 4 years ago. And we started giving talks about the project and people would ask, well, have you encountered any challenges? And 3 or 4 years ago, my answer was, wow, actually, no, things have been going pretty well. And that has changed. And I want to walk through these a little bit. First challenge was actually started out to be something we were thrilled about. Beavers came in. Tons of wildlife has been coming back as the forest has regrown and the streams improved. So they built a dam and flooded. They killed a bunch of our little trees, which broke our hearts a little bit. We had this salmon. I mean, beaver are great for salmon. So if you're working on salmon restoration, you love beavers have in your watershed. So we were thrilled when beavers came in. We had this gorgeous pond, tons of wildlife using the pond, frogs and kingfishers and herons and stuff. But then the beavers ran out of food because the forests are still regrowing and they abandoned the dam and it broke. And so we had a big mud flat that grew in an invasive grass called reed canary grass, which if any of you have been engaged in this work, you know, too much of Minnesota is covered with it. Out here, it grows, it can get 9 feet tall. and it smothers everything. And it's dismal habitat for wildlife, zero biodiversity, basically one species. It's a monoculture. So we had a problem, and we had to address it with brute force. So we started planting willow trees. This is tiny little wisp is a willow stake. This is for a cottonwood that we put in. This is my sister. You have to beat down the reed canary, otherwise it grows 9 feet. And if you're planting little baby sap seedlings, native trees, the reed canary just swamps them and drowns them. So we have to fold it down. And it's, I mean, this is in July and August. It's hot and it's miserable work, but actually kind of rewarding when you find a little baby underneath and free it so it can grow. And those trees and shrubs we started planting 4 or 5 years ago are now getting above the reed canary. We're starting to win, and they will eventually shade out the reed canary. So we're confident we can restore the habitat with a, you know, higher biodiversity and higher impact on wildlife and other creatures. Challenge number 2. So the focus of this project has been about bringing salmon back. Because they're just an iconic species and ecological linchpin in the Pacific Northwest. These are chum salmon in Tarboo Creek. A friend of mine took this photo. So we've been working on this little creek, and tons of other groups and tribes across the Pacific Northwest have been working on other little creeks or even rivers. But we can't control what's going out in the ocean. So I want you guys to figure out this graph. So this is Alaska. If you can trace my cursor, coast of British Columbia, Pacific North, Washington, Oregon, coast of California, down to Baja California. All right, this is a graph of seawater temperature at the surface. And the way the oceanographers put these graphs together, they'll say, okay, what was the average temperature over this 30-year period, 1981 to 2010? And then they say, okay, in February to March 2015, so this is 6 years ago now, what is the actual temperature compared to that? Sorry, that was really fast. Did you guys? So this is how different is the water temp? And this is the scale. This is in degrees Celsius. So red is 2 degrees Celsius. If it's cooler by -2, you'd see deep purple. So what are you seeing off the coast of Washington State and British Columbia? If you could type into the Q&A or chat.
Kristen says warming.
Yeah, big time. Over 2 degrees Celsius. You guys, this was a disaster. The orcas, killer whales from Puget Sound are in danger because it hit salmon populations so hard. There were hundreds of thousands of seabirds that died because their food disappeared. Salmon and other big, fast species need a lot of oxygen, and warm water carries less oxygen than cold water, so they literally suffocate. So our salmon runs disappeared for 3 years. We saw virtually no fish in Tarboo Creek after all this work. This last fall, we got on our place, we had 4 nests again. So it's a first indicate the blob disappeared. Sorry, this big red thing, oceanographers call it the blob, because that's what it looked like, mapped like this. The blob disappeared, and so the surface water increased, and then eventually currents broke it up, and water temperatures got back closer to normal. Salmon are just starting to recover, so we have some glimmers of hope on this issue. But with global warming continuing, we're you know, we don't know what's going to happen. Last challenge, and this is this one. In 2017, a neighbor of ours at Tarboo Creek walked up and said, "Did you guys see the paper? Did you see this?" And this was what was published in the paper, this drawing. This is Tarboo Lake, what I'm tracing with my cursor, and a tributary to Tarboo Creek that actually flows through some forest land we own now, flows through it. So this is very close to the project I just showed you and feeds it. A guy bought 40 acres of forest land and was proposing to build 7 gun ranges and a training center with 2, and then later he expanded to 3 helicopter pads. And it turned out he wanted to develop this because we started researching who is this guy and what is he really up to. Among other things, he manufactures AR-15s, and for years his shtick was that, okay, well, let me back up a step. He's very closely tied to what people call the prepper subculture, prepper recon, prepper groups that are sort of tied to paramilitary groups, people who are anticipating a breakdown of government and law and order, and we all have to defend ourselves with our AR-15s. So he was selling these AR-15s, and his thing was, when you buy my rifle, I'll give you this coin called the Rally Point coin. And when he called it, when all else fails, when the other line in this world is when the SHIT hits the fan, you're going to take your Rally Point. What he tells you is, bring your AR-15 and your 1,000 rounds of ammunition and your Rally Point coin, and you get into the Rally Point, and where all the patriots are going to gather here. So the new Rally Point was going to be at Tarboo Lake. This was his plan, with his 7-gun ranges and his helicopter pads. And worse than that, his lawyer, he has a full-time attorney who works for his company, publishes under a pseudonym, which is Glenn Tate. And this is one of his tweets from 2018. Let's start using the hashtag to collect articles about the Second American Civil War. So this is what this is the world these guys in, what they want to do. And we saw a lot of that played out in January 6th. So this is what we were up against. And we organized with a bunch of other people in the neighborhood, a community organization we called the Tarboo Ridge Coalition, to oppose it. And this is a tiny rural county. It's economically distressed. According to the state of Washington, a lot of rural poverty, but people rallied. We were submitting petitions to the county government with 1,500 signatures that we could get together in a week, because people were so lit up about this. And eventually we got a county law passed banning outdoor gun ranges and training centers like this. And our guy who was proposing this sued him, of course. He had 8 lawsuits pending against the county. He's been trying to beat them into submission with lawsuits. But he recently retracted all of those. He settled with the county. So we think we won, and we've saved Tarboo Creek and the county and the country from at least this little threat. So that's our third challenge, and I sort of brought you up to date on where my 2 stories are about working for Salmon and Social Justice. And I just want to end with a appeal to you guys your generation is facing 2 problems that can be absolutely paralyzing in their size and scope. And what I want to ask you is, please don't be paralyzed. Please join this work. You guys are important. Carleton is giving you the tools to do something that matters. So thank you for being here. And we have some time for questions now.
Yes, thank you, Scott. And let's turn to some audience questions. And here's the first. After having authored textbooks, what was it that led you to write Saving Tarboo Creek, which is a book for, as you said, a general audience?
I actually connected my teaching. The course I taught a lot, dealt with a lot of these issues. We would introduce students to climate change and trends in human population growth and resource use and deforestation. And I could see for freshmen who were in the course, it was just devastating. It was like, oh my God, what kind of world are we walking into here as early career professionals? And yet we were doing this Tarboo Creek project that was so hopeful to me and so immediate, where you could plant the tree and see it grow and see things get better. I wanted to tell both of those stories, and it seemed like that this book was the way to do it. So that would be my short answer to the question, is that I just hope that message resonates with some people.
In climate change education, what is the impact of using local rather than global evidence?
Oh, we've actually done some research on that. That's amazing. We asked the same question about 8 years ago and did a project. We actually did a project where we had students learn about climate change using global examples that were really extreme, or local examples that were maybe not as extreme, but more immediate. And we found that, especially for women, that local examples were much more powerful. Their learning rate increased, and their commitment to doing something really increased. And I think in general, I don't know what your take is. It would be a fantastic discussion, but I think the fires and droughts and intense storms that are hitting different impacts at different parts of the planet are finally bringing home to people like this actually matters to me and my family and my community.
Yeah, you are not only an environmentalist, but as you've shown, an advocate for dismantling racist traditions in STEM classrooms, and you've talked about some ways of doing that. Do you have a sense of hope for progress in that area?
Oh man. Oh man, oh man. The $64,000 question. Institutions of higher education, and you guys, I'm going to be really opinionated here, so pardon me, but sometimes I think, Scott, you're getting old and cranky. Higher education is a system that's set up to resist change. So people have been lecturing in Western universities were set up almost 1,000 years ago, and the style of teaching hasn't changed. So access has changed, that's positive. Tenure, I have to be frank. I've been in so many workshops and so many, well-intentioned, innovative, well-funded programs to improve teaching and equity and outcomes, and the project directors are banging their heads against the wall saying we can't get the tenured professors to change what they're doing, and we can't touch them, So that part of the system is really resistant to change. Even with the escalating costs, every administrator at Carleton will tell you that the finances are really tough. On the other hand, I've seen young faculty start and what I call native speakers of active learning, and it's like I'm not going to lecture. No, that stinks. I've seen the data and I've seen it in the classroom now. I've experienced more and more people have experienced and say, this is the way to learn. This is the way to teach. So I think, like so many things, it's going to be generational change. And that's pessimistic to me, because I think I want change right now. Like, to me, they're the data, change right now. And the pessimistic part is that that's probably not going to happen. Like lecturing, they're good data showing out it still dominates science teaching in the US. It's way different than it was 15 years ago. That's the optimistic part. But, human beings don't like change, and it's hard. If they're business and econ majors in the audience today, it's a whole, how do you get human beings and institutions to change? It's a huge area of research and difficult. There are a lot of people invested in the status quo.
How would someone who is inspired by this, by your story, find their own Tarboo Creek areas to begin engaging with? Yeah,
that's my first piece of advice. Find your own. And it can be almost anything. It can be a little scabby little former dump, or when I was a Carleton student, we started working on the Arboretum because it was fantastic. Carl bought this place and preserved it during the Depression, but like nobody had touched it, and so it was full of nasty invasives and stuff. And we just started going in there and trying to do something. And from what I've been told, it's a really healthy, diverse, biodiverse area now. But that's one of my messages of the book, is just be engaged, do something. There are volunteer groups, tons of conservation organizations sponsor volunteer days. You can plant trees or remove invasives, and you're having a material, real impact on making things better. So it's very both immediate rewards, and then the coolest thing about the Tarboo Creek project to me is that I was sitting in a group, a local, just a community event a couple years ago, and they were giving an award to a high school student from one of the local high schools here, who was going on to college. He was receiving a little scholarship award, and he said, "I'm going to study environmental stuff and ecology and restoration." And he didn't know who I was, and I didn't know who he was, but he said, I got started with my interest because when I was in second grade, I planted trees at Tarboo Creek. Yeah, that always makes me emotional. But do something like that. Well, this has been extremely instructive, Scott. Do you have a closing comment before we leave today? I think just to reinforce what I try to ask you guys at the end is that, again, you think of you know, what happened to George Floyd and so many other Black and brown young men and women, and it's happening almost daily, these tragedies. After 400 years of systemic racism, it can be overwhelming. And looking at the planet and the rate of mass extinction can be overwhelming. But there's no more important work to do, you guys, and nobody's done it before. We have to do this, and I believe we can, because it is happening. It needs to happen faster, but it is happening. I believe we're going to win this thing, but it's going to be because we fight.
Thank you again, Scott. And thank you all for joining us today. Next week, psychologist and writer Shira Naiman will talk about the power of storytelling. Until then, please be conscious of how we treat the land and how we treat one another. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.